Hey guys, my name is Evan and welcome to Evanomics 101, your number one source for everything econ. So inflation just cooled again, but don't celebrate too quickly. The latest July 2026 CPI report showed U.S. consumer prices rising only 0.1% for the month, while annual inflation slowed from 3.5% in June to 3.4% in July. Now, that sounds like good news, but here's the problem. 3.4% is still significantly above the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target. And at the same time, the labor market just delivered a weak July jobs report. We now have an interesting situation where inflation is cooling, but the economy is showing some signs of weakness. We're going to kind of connect on everything. Here's what we're going to break down. Number one, what actually happened with the July CPI number, including gasoline, food, shelter, and core inflation. Why inflation can be falling while consumers still feel everything is expensive, and most importantly, what this means for the Federal Reserve, financial markets, and the average everyday consumer. Before we jump into the video, I do have a quick favor that really helps grow the channel. If you enjoy straightforward economics and finance explained without all the complicated jargon, please hit the like button, subscribe to Evanomics 101, and turn your notifications on. It really helps the channel tremendously. Now let's jump to the numbers. So let's start with the numbers that pretty much everybody has seen starting last week. And that's the number. It increased 0.1% month over month. That followed a surprising 0.4% decline in June. On an annual basis, inflation came in at 3.4%, and that's down from 3.5% in June. So at first glance, this looks like good news. But there's an important distinction here. When we say inflation falling, we're talking about the rate at which prices are increasing. We're not saying that prices are backwards. Think about it this way. If you got a grocery bill that went from $100 to $110, that's a 10% increase. If the next year it goes from 110 to 113, inflation has slowed to 3%. Inflation is still paying $113. So that July data tells us that prices are still climbing, just at a slower pace. And that's where the details become interesting, okay? So what actually drove CPI? We're gonna start with energy. That's the one that I think everybody is aware of. All you have to do is simply look at your gas prices, okay? So the energy index fell 1.5% in July, while gasoline prices dropped 2.9% during the month. And even though energy prices fell during the month, the energy index was still 14.7% higher than it was a year earlier. So we're seeing a short improvement inside a much bigger picture where energy remains expensive. Now let's talk about food. Food prices increased 0.1% in July. That was mild. Grocery prices actually went lower while food away from home increased. And then we get to shelter. Shelter represents such a large part of the consumer price basket. It accounted for roughly 2/3 of July's overall monthly CPI increase. And that's an important detail. And that brings us to the number of economists and Fed officials, what they really want to understand. And that's core inflation, okay? So core CPI, it removes food and energy because it can be extremely volatile. In July, core CPI increased 0.2% month over month. And over the last year, core inflation was 2.5%, down from 2.6% in June. Remember, the Fed's target is 2%, and policymakers are looking at multiple pieces of information. So you had healthcare prices, they rebounded a little bit. Airline fares jumped. Technology goods also increased, while categories such as motor vehicle insurance were a little bit lower. In other words, this isn't a perfectly clean inflation story. Some prices are cooling, others are still rising, and that's exactly why the Fed can't simply look at one headline number and basically declare victory. You have to look at multiple reports. So one of the biggest economic developments surrounding the CPI report isn't actually inside the CPI. It's the labor market. According to the latest July employment report, U.S. non-farm payroll employment fell by 23,000, while the unemployment rate was 4.1%. I made a video last week about the employment numbers, but that's a very different signal from the inflation data. Inflation is saying price pressure is cooling. The job market is saying economic momentum may be weakening. And when those two things happen at the same time, the Fed it's faced with a balancing act. So what this means so let's put let's put the story together. As the Federal Reserve's interest rate target is 3.5% to 3.7%. July CPI gives policymakers some breathing room. Headline inflation fell to 3.4%. Core inflation is at 2.5%. Gasoline prices, they did come down. And the labor just produced a weak employment reading. That's the good news if you're hoping the Fed doesn't raise rates. And financial markets reacted, they acted accordingly. But here's the other side. The Fed fact that inflation is still above target. And policymakers haven't seen enough evidence yet to say the inflation problem is completely gone. Quick pause, guys. If you enjoy or if you want more breakdowns like this, make sure you're subscribed to Economics 101. We're going to keep tracking inflation, interest rates, jobs, markets, and the economy as these numbers come out on a monthly basis. If you have a prediction for the Fed's next comments. Now let's hop back into the video and talk about what this means for you. So for the average consumer, there are really two stories that are happening right now. Story number one is news. Inflation is no longer accelerating at the rates we saw during the worst periods of the inflation surge. July 0.1% monthly increase is relatively modest. Gasoline prices also fell. But story number two is why people may still feel financially squeezed. A lower inflation rate doesn't erase previous price increases. If rent, groceries, insurance, and other expenses are already much higher than they were several years ago, slowing inflation doesn't automatically bring those prices back down. It simply means that they may be rising just slowly. If prices are still rising while real wages are struggling, households can continue feeling pressure. So from a consumer perspective, July's report is better, but it's not necessarily everything is fixed report. For investors, inflation matters because it influences interest rates, and interest rates influence almost everything. If August inflation suddenly jumps because of energy prices, the narrative can change very, very quickly. And key point, the July CPI report didn't end the Fed debate, it's moved the debate. Instead of asking, is inflation accelerating again, markets are gonna ask, or can ask, is inflation actually cooling enough for the Fed to stay on hold, or are we gonna drop interest rates? So what happens next? What should we watch for from here? I would say August CPI report. The next CPI report is scheduled for September 11th. That report could be extremely important because it arrives just before the Fed's September meeting. Second, watch the labor market. If it's weakening while inflation remains moderate, the Fed's policy calculation becomes much more complicated. And third, watch energy prices. July benefited from falling gasoline prices, but renewed energy pressure could reverse some of that progress. And finally, watch the Fed itself, because the central bank isn't just looking at one CPI report. Big takeaway from all of this is that the inflation picture is cooling while the economy is becoming more complicated. And that puts the Federal Reserve in a tight spot. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think they hold interest rates where they are, or do you think they should cut rates or raise them in the next meeting? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, or if it helped you understand the July CPI report, make sure to subscribe to Economics 101. Again, this is Economics 101. Thank you for tuning in. See you on the next video.